Welcome, everybody, to Computational Music, our new series of speakers with some of the best artists and programmers and artists slash programmers that are around today. And we're very grateful today to have Melody Loveless coming in to speak with us on Max programming and her life in music and her life as an artist. So we're really grateful to have you here. And let's maybe kick off with the idea of how did you come to have a life like this? So our students are a range of ages, but they're just starting their journeys in terms of education and music technology. And many of them aspire to be in the place you're at. And so if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about what journey got you here.
Sure. I mean, first, yeah, thanks for having me and all the kind words. Yeah, so getting to this point, it was definitely not a straightforward path for me. So my undergrad was in music performance, and I technically have a BA. I don't even have like a Bachelor of Music, and that's because I took so many electives to get there. But I had like a performance emphasis. So I started off with percussion and
Oh,
then I ended up moving to New York from Las Vegas. And so when I moved to New York, I studied music composition at NYU. And then after I graduated from that degree, I had some time where I was just working, trying to make it as an artist, and I was working at a grocery store and like service jobs. And so I ended up going back to school because I wanted something a bit more sustainable because I found myself working so much that I actually wasn't doing music the way that I wanted.
yeah,
If
right.
you,
That's a
yeah,
that's a pitfall for a lot of our students, right? And I mean, the retail industry will take as many hours as you have to give.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's a bold move. So that's a bold move. So kind of continuing your education was a secret there.
it was. And I had a genuine interest in working with tech even before went into that. I'm from the MySpace era, right? So the internet was definitely like a playground, for customizing in HTML. And it felt like a very practical move because yeah, again, I was working and as artists, if you're working on the weekends, that's like a big networking part as like a working artist. And being from Vegas, I knew that. I was like, I got to get out of
Um,
this. And so I went back to school to study, and I got a master's of science in integrated digital media. And that was like a real push towards like getting more work because also from it was like a hard time to get a job in general, and some people can get into tech without a degree, but I wasn't in that position where it was easy for me.
so let's think for a minute though, because that's a brave move. So you had a BA, you didn't have a bachelor's of science, you had a bachelor of arts degree. Here you are in a master's level program in a science kind of field. Um, like, how did you negotiate that? Did you just screw up your courage? Did you feel like you were always the one who had to ask more questions, or had you kind of learned on your own a lot of pieces that helped you out when you showed up at NYU?
Right. I will say I was familiar with tech and working with computers at that point. So something I didn't mention was for my work study when I was at NYU, I was working as an assistant web editor in the journalism school.
Oh,
And so that was like another thing. Like I was trying to work into tech after I graduated with my music degree, and I was hoping that experience would help me. That's kind of why I set myself up for that. But it was a difficult time when I graduated school. There wasn't a lot of work.
yeah.
So yeah, that's another big part why I ended up going to work because I knew that tech could be viable and I could make it work if I tried. Um, and so actually part of the thing is, towards the end of my music program, I was starting to take more music technology courses. And one of the professors that I took a course from really inspired me to pursue the MS. And that's another reason, that's what led me to the integrated digital media program. Because, you were like mentioning, as a bold move going from art and music into science. And I think having that professor kind of there as like a transition person, somebody I could refer to
Mm.
was a big point for me because this was a person who studied music and he had a PhD from music composition in Columbia. His name's Luc Dubois, but he worked for Cycling 74 and helped develop jitter. So he was like someone who was like, okay, he can do it, and I like his style. So that was a lucky thing for me, I think.
So, that's really good advice. I think there's some lessons in there that are really timely. So, one is that things ebb and flow. So, you may get out of school at a time when there's lots of jobs, not lots of jobs, jobs for you, no jobs for you. Like, that's part of life. And the other thing is that, like, you found the right kind of mentors. Like, you found the kind of people by putting yourself in a situation where really good people are, right? I mean, NYU, you're going to find people like Luke Dubois, like you're going to find the type of people who can give you good guidance. So that's fantastic. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm very, very lucky for that. And then yeah, and then when I graduated, I ended up teaching, and I ended up teaching Max at Harvest Works. And so I think that's like a big part of where I am now with like the Max certification.
Uh-huh. Terrific. And I think I've seen you, haven't you been on Music Hackspace? And yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah. So that's a terrific community that's developing over there. Oh, well, brilliant. Well, we have students who are just meeting Max for the first time. And so many of them do not have programming backgrounds, though we have some computer science students we pull in as well. So they're kind of coming to find the power of this visual programming language. And we were hoping you could kind of give us some pointers today on things that Max can do for you, things that have been fun for you to play with and explore as you came to build more and more power in Max.
Sure. Sounds great. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start sharing my screen, and I'm gonna also start talking a bit more about Max.
Great.
So Max, also known as Max MSP, is a visual programming language for music and multimedia. It is extremely versatile. It's used for so many things. So for example, people use Max to build custom instruments and interfaces. They use Max to create multi-channel sound installations or situate or setups. So multi-channel sound is pretty much anything that involves more than like two speakers. So like 4 speakers, 40 speakers. You can use Max to create an environment for multi-channel sound. You can use it for audio reactive projects, hooking up for computer vision. So computer vision is like the computer's ability to see, right? So processing human shapes or counting the number of bodies. You can hook Max up to sensors. And you can also get data from the internet, all sorts of things. It's really extremely powerful. And that's why I think it's so popular, right? Is because you can do so much with it. And so today we're going to focus on a small but really cool part of Max, and that's specifically using Max to work with MIDI data. And so I'm going to open up some files, and that's going to open up our Max application. And so right now we should see my screen, and you should see my
Yep.
Finder. And so here we see some files, and at the end you see this .maxpat. And so this is called a patcher, and this is the standard type of file in Max. And if I double click on this and I have Max installed, the file will open. And what we're looking at right now is the patcher, right? And so this is code, right? But this is something called a visual programming language. So it's not going to look like your standard text editor, like if you're writing in HTML or JavaScript. It's more visual. And so some of you might be familiar with programming in something like Scratch or Snap, where there are little block modules and you snap the blocks together to perform an action. Max is sort of similar. We have things called objects. So I'm zooming in right now. And so these little rectangles are objects. And so objects are similar to functions in JavaScript or P5.js, right? And so objects are programming, are pieces of programs that perform a specific function, right? So objects are similar to functions in P5. And so there's so many objects, and we're not going to get to talk about all of the objects in Max today, but we're going to go over a few that handle MIDI. And so before we even talk about these objects, I want to talk a little bit more about MIDI. this term might be already familiar to y'all. MIDI is a technical standard for communicating musical data on your computer. And so there's so many devices you've already probably interacted with that use MIDI. So if you've ever used a MIDI controller like this, the Zoom is blurring it out, but this is a keyboard. Right? So this is a device that sends out MIDI data. So when you push keys on this keyboard is sending out numbers associated with the pitches on my keyboard, right? So for example, middle C is 60. That's the pitch value in MIDI. And so that's one example of a device that uses MIDI. If you've ever used GarageBand, Ableton, Sibelius, or Finale, those also use MIDI. So you've probably had the option to export or import a MIDI file, right? So that's another popular thing, or another popular device that uses MIDI. And so we're going to talk about using MIDI in Max MSP. And so we're going to be mostly focusing on working with pitch and velocity. And so pitch, right, it corresponds to high or low notes. If you want to think about a piano, right, piano notes that are higher in pitch are like on the right side of the piano if you're facing it to perform, right? And they are very high, they're a high frequency. And then values that are, or notes that are lower in pitch sound low, you know, maybe closer to like a bass drum or a bass note, a lower note. And so in Max, we can, or in MIDI rather, you can communicate pitches by saying a value, right? And so these values are, there are values associated with each pitch on a standard grand piano keyboard. And so the range of these numbers is 0 through 127. So there are 128 keys on a grand piano. And so MIDI, right, takes those keys, assigns them a number, and you can call these numbers to trigger some pitches. And so I'm going to start playing with my Max patch in front of us. And so I'm going to click on this number box, type in 60, and then I'm going to hit return on my keyboard. And so what we heard just now together is a piano note ring out. And so what I'm doing technically is I'm setting a number, which is associated with a pitch, to a series of objects, which is triggering a note, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about these objects in front of us. And so this first one over here is called make note, right? And so make note is an object that's going to generate a MIDI note and on and off message. So it's generating a list, and it's sending off a pitch value, and then it's sending off of velocity, a value corresponding to velocity, right? And so here we see make note, and then we see the number 128 and then 500. And so what we're saying here is make a note, assign it a velocity of 128, and have it last for 500 milliseconds. And so when we're talking about the velocity being 128, this is also similar to how MIDI pitches have a range of 0 through 127. So you have 128 values, right? When for velocity, you also have 128 possible values to assign to your velocity. But instead, I'm using 128 to designate like maximum instead. So instead, you're going to work with like 1 through 128 instead of 0 through 127. And here, right, this make note, what's happening is it's taking in this incoming value, 60, or that's what it did, right? And then it's generating a velocity value, so corresponding to the volume, right? And it's also triggering the duration. And so I want to kind of highlight this right side of the equation when I change this value up on top. So I'm going to enter in 60 again. And something you're going to see is on the right side, you're going to see the number 128 turn on, and then you're going to see it flash away and turn back to 0. So I'm going to do that. So it goes 128 and then it's off, right? So what's happening here is on the left side, we can see from the make note object, we see the same value for the pitch that's coming on the left side. So if I change this to something else like 56, we're going to see the left side chord update. On the right side, though, we still see this 128 flash on and off. And so I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of a flashing on and flashing off, right? So we're working with a computer, which is something that's super, super mechanical, right? And so when we're communicating musical data, we not only have to specify when a note is executed or turned on, we have to be specific when it turns off. So how long is this note going to last? Right? And so that's a huge part of working with MIDI data, is getting a handle of figuring out, what's turning on and what's turning off and how to control that type of data. And
yeah,
so,
I think a lot of our students, like, this is hard in computer science too, right? It's hard to understand like how stupid computers are compared to the intuition you have as a human being. So you play music, you don't worry about it. You understand that the notes have a certain lifetime, they turn on, they off, but we have to explain every single idea into the computer. And so the MIDI, there's actually two MIDI messages, right? Like you have to tell it, turn the note on, then you have to tell it another thing, so it's like speaking to a very simple, simple understanding.
yeah. Yes, exactly. It's so literal.
Yeah.
And that's like, yeah, that's exactly. It's a huge part of working with Macs and working with computers. And so this right side of our system, right, we're seeing the note or the velocity flash on and off. So when we're the pitch in a way is separate from for the velocity. So you can think of it as play the pitch at 60 and then play the pitch at 0, right? That's technically what's happening when we're doing this. We're saying play it for 128 for half a second and then play it and set it at 0 and then we're done when after we finish that note, right? And yeah, that can be something to get a little bit used to when you're working with MIDI. But once you do get that principle down, it becomes a lot easier. It's just so on off. And another thing to get used to when you're working with Macs, or at least with the make note object, is this idea of working in milliseconds. So in music, we are used to working in beats per minute a lot of the time, which is like a standard way of communicating time in music, right? When you're working with computers, though, you need to be performing operations at a much higher speed. Your computer is a fancy computer that's doing math very, very quickly, right? And so that's why we communicate a lot of things in Macs using milliseconds instead. And so that's what's happening here with make notes. We have make note velocity at 128. The duration is 500 milliseconds. And so a trick that I like to remember is that 1000 milliseconds equals 1 second. So 500 milliseconds is half a second. So that's why it flashes on and off so quickly when I change the pitch going into make note. If I wanted to see it, if I want to like adjust this make note duration, what I can do is I can unlock my patch. So I'm going to click on this unlock button on the bottom left. And now my patch is editable. And what I'm going to now do is I'm going to change this number 500 and change it to something else. So I'm going to do 2000. So that's 2 seconds. If I lock my patch, so go back to the bottom left and click lock. If I can now change this, and we will see the bottom right is going to last a lot longer at 128. So it lasted for 2 seconds before going back to 0. Yeah. And so there's one more part of the system that I haven't talked about yet, and this is an object here called note out. So note out is the objects that's sending the MIDI on and off messages from our make note to something called a MIDI device. And so in Max, when I'm talking about like this MIDI device, I'm talking about an instrument that is assigned to a particular channel, right? And so note out one is taking this incoming data and sending it to channel one. And so something about channels is that channels are by default assigned an instrument, and that instrument happens to be a ground piano. And so when you put this all together, right, we have our pitch, it's sending out it's going into a make note. Make note is taking the pitch and generating a list of values for pitch and velocity. Those are both being sent to a MIDI channel device at channel one, or a MIDI instrument at channel one, and that's a piano. So we hear a piano.
And that's just because people agreed to assign piano to channel one before we got here. Like people have been using Max for a long time and MIDI for a long time before we got to learn about this and get started. So some decisions have already been made.
Exactly. Yeah, and that goes on, like there's always like some sort of standard, right? Just like 0 is piano and 10 is percussion or something like that. Yeah, and so there are ways in Max for us to be able to also reassign those instruments, and that's by adding another object. And so at the bottom of the system, so closer to the bottom left, you see an object here called PGM out one. And so this is here PGM out, and this is, I like to think of it as program out, and we see the number 1. And so what this object does is it lets us reassign the instrument at channel 1. And so what I could do is I can change the number going into PGM out 1. So I'm just going to do something like 15. And now I'm going to go back to this system over here, and I should now hear a different instrument. So that's like some sort of tubular bells. And so if you want to know what instruments are assigned to what value, I recommend Googling it and going to the Wikipedia page. That's like a really good chart. They have like really good charts on the internet in general showing you what instrument is assigned to what number.
And so actually, like for the computer science folks, right? Like, so that is picking a certain MIDI channel, but that's being sent to some software algorithm somewhere, right? Like it sounds so realistic. It sounds like there's an actual acoustic bell being struck somewhere, but it's all the power of math.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a great point. Yeah, it's interesting because when we're triggering this right now with the node out and PGM out one, we're triggering the default the default general MIDI instruments that are pretty much on almost any computer. But I was just like doing a lecture looking at Laurie Spiegel building these synthesizer and what that was like, and the first beginning MIDI instruments, which isn't very long ago, and they're so much more primitive and they were way more huge, and now it's on a laptop.
No. I know it's one of those things. I worked when I did my graduate work at Penn, and so my office was in the building where the first UNIVAC computer was.
Oh.
So it was the offices for like 15 people now, but it was one computer at one time.
Cool. Right. Yeah. So I'll just like keep on talking about MIDI. I have more on this patch. So I went over a few systems where we were just triggering some simple pitches, right? By typing in values into our system and triggering them with the keyboard. Max, though, I mentioned, is really versatile. And I want to go over this other system on the right with another object that's going to allow us to start getting data from our MIDI keyboard. Right, and so I'm going to give these patches over like at the end of this, so people, if they have Max, can open
great.
up. So I'll give this out later, but so do not fret. I'm going to just demo them now. So what we see over here is another object called note in. And note in is something that allows us to take MIDI notes in. And so if I double click on this note in object, I'll see a list of different MIDI devices that I could possibly route in MIDI information in, right? And so MIDI is not just for Macs or for applications, it's also for controllers. And so what I'm interested in doing is, there might be a point where I might want to use a MIDI controller to manipulate a Max patch. And so I might use a system like this to start off with doing that. So I'm going to double click on this node in, and then I'm going to pick the device that I want to hook up to Max, which is going to be my Mini Lab keyboard. And so I'm going to select this. Now, if I start hitting keys on my key, I start to see some changes. And so I actually have another software open. Oh no, or did I hook it up to something else? I might have something else open in the background that I forgot about, which I can't find. That's funny. That's okay. We'll find it eventually.
Yeah, so this is actually the heart of it, right? Like this is like the part that has to be fun for you when you do computers and music technology is you have to like when things go wrong. Like when things always go right, then there's no fun to it. But when it's a problem to figure out, that's the fun of it. So somehow there's some other program that's grabbing your MIDI information. That's your theory right now, and you're debugging this.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's such a great point. Yes. I'm trying to figure out what application is sending out the sound when I trigger it. Right now on my screen, we can see that the numbers are coming in, but they shouldn't be triggering something else. And so I have so many things open right now between Ableton and Max that I cannot tell where the sound is coming out from. And you're totally right. I try to take a light-hearted approach to it because it's just like if you don't, you'll drive yourself.
Yeah, it won't be any fun at all.
No.
Like you have to be okay with the adventure.
Right. And so I'm not quite sure what so what I did is I think it was I was testing my audio earlier and it was triggering one of the tests in a different application. Mm-hmm. So I had to close that. There we go. We have our object, right? Note in. I'm pushing keys on my keyboard, and same as before with the values that the note out was generate, or the make note object was generate pitch and velocity. When I hit this key on my keyboard, right, I'm generating different values for pitch and velocity. And so in this case, this is a touch sensitive keyboard. So if I hit very lightly, we see that the value for the velocity is fairly low. So right now it's like below, this is 10, so that's very low. But if I push harder, the velocity is higher. And so we want to think of, that's something to like think about, what is velocity trying to emulate or replicate? It's trying to emulate when a performer plays an instrument a little more, roughly, or maybe emulate the sound of 4 voices versus 1, something that's just going to be physically louder.
And the power of visual programming is on display here too, right? So we also teach Java. And in Java, it would take us most of a year to get to the level of programming sophistication that your program could interact with something in the real world, like the value of those keys and how hard they're being pressed, and be able to communicate that information back and forth through a protocol like MIDI. But in Max, you can do it the first day.
Yes. No, there's so much behind the scenes that offloads the work so that we can have some fun, right? Like
that's the power. That's right. And again, the computer science, like that's a very fancy term. That's encapsulation, right? So we've encapsulated all of these jobs inside this one little note in box. Mm-hmm. And that's a very powerful tool.
Yes, it is. Right. So let's see. We talked a bit about MIDI and we went over some objects that will let us trigger some MIDI pitches and whatnot. I want to go over a little bit more on the Max MSP side. So, getting to more familiar, what is an object in general, and whatnot. And
Great.
so I'm gonna to do this, I'm gonna start from scratch. So let's don't save that. And so when you want to start off from scratch in Max, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to File, New Patcher. I have two windows right now, so you can't see me doing this, but I'm doing File, New Patcher. Here, I'll do this again. So let's do File, and then let's do New Patcher. There you go. And now I have a New Patcher window. And so, again, this is a visual programming language. So you can think of this as your text editor, like if you're using Atom or Sublime, but it's not going to behave the same way as a text editor, obviously. This is more of a drag and drop situation. This is visual. We can rearrange things with our mouse. And so what I'm going to also do before I even start patching is I like to save my work right away. And I recommend people get into that habit when they're working. If you don't already, especially when you're coding, because you never know what's going to break something. Um, and so now that I've saved my patcher, so I did file save, saved it, I'm going to start patching. And so I mentioned this earlier, an object, right? Objects in Max are very important. They are basically functions in different languages. So in P5, this would be considered a function. And so objects are boxes that perform certain actions or pieces of code that perform certain actions. And so if I want to create a new object in Max, first thing I'm going to want to make sure is that my patch is unlocked. So currently my patch is unlocked. By default, when you create a new patch, it should be unlocked. Just in case, you might need to unlock your patch. And to do that, you would go to the bottom left corner and click unclick. And so, or you'd click once to toggle rather the lock or unlock. And so I currently locked my patch. If I click again, my patch is unlocked. I'll see that the unlock hinge or the icon looks like a lock that is unhinged. And the background also has a bunch of dots. This might be hard to see on Zoom, but you should be able to see this on your end.
Yep, we got it.
So my patch is unlocked, and now I should be able to create a new object. And so there are different ways for us to do that. I can use this top bar over here. And so the object far top left is, or the icon rather, it's called an object when I hover. And so if I click on this, a new object will appear in my screen. So that's one way. I recommend the shortcut, which is N for new. So if I hit N on my keyboard, I now have a new object. And so by default, my box for my object is going to be blank. So it doesn't have any properties inside. And the type of word, or what rather, the text that I put inside is going to define or assign this blank object box to one of the many objects in Max. And so the first one I want to talk about is called random. And so random is going to be an object that's going to generate random numbers. Before I finish this off, though, I have to initialize a range for this object, right? And so on my screen right now, I can see that Max is also trying to give me some hints about what I can type. So here it says arguments, and then you can see range and seed, right? And so I want to define the range. So I know I'm in the right direction. For now, I'm going to write random 128. And so what I've done just now is I've created a random number object that's going to give me 128 random numbers. And this one is going to generate 128 numbers in this case. And so another thing though, that we should know is that in this case, it's going to generate random numbers between 0 through 127, and that's because 0 is a number. So this is something to keep an eye for as we use this object. So I got an object, but now I want to be able to use it in a system, and that's going to require a few more things to hook up to this. So first, I want to be able to see my random number exit through this object. So I'm going to create a number object. I can use one of these up here. So if I go to the top row, there's an icon. When I hover, it says numbers. If I click on this drop down, I'll see different types of numbers that I can pick from. For now, I'm going to just pick this one that says number with the parentheses I. So if I click on that, that's going to give me a random number box. I can also just do I on my keyboard, and that'll also do the same thing. And so this I is short for integer, and so this is a whole number. And so this might be a little bit of a computer sciencey idea for some people, right? Like you might not be used to working with number types or data types, but that's going to be important with working in Macs. You have to be specific when you're working with whole numbers versus numbers with decimal values, which are floats. So I have a number box, which is going to show me the random numbers coming from this object. Next thing I want to do is I want to figure out a way to trigger this. And so to trigger this, I'm going to create another object here called a button. And to do that, I can click on this up here and select button. I can also use the shortcut, which is in parentheses, which is B. So I'm going to use the shortcut. I'm going to hit B, and now I've created a new button. And so what I want to do with this button is I want to trigger the system below using a button, right? You push a button to do a thing. That's exactly what I want right now. I'm going to connect this button to this object by going from the bottom of the button to the top of the random. And so what I've done here is I've now created a system. And so if I want to think about the signal flow or the way the system flows into each other logically, right? I have a button which is connected into my random number object. This random number object is going to trigger or send out a random number, which is going to be visualized into this number object. And so I want to trigger this, but right now, if I click in my patch, things move around, so I can't trigger the button. And this is because I need to lock my patch. So when your patch is locked, you can now interact with it. So now I'm clicking around and things are not moving. And now if I click on this button, I'm able to trigger a random number in the system. And so, yeah.
Right. And that's a great range for MIDI, as we said before, because a lot of things are in that 0 to 127 range.
Exactly. And so what we have right now is like the beginning of something that we could, a random number generator that we can use with our MIDI system. And so in the other patch before, right, we had something like this where we had our make note attached to our note out, and that sends some pitches. And so now what I want to do is I want to combine these two, right? And so there's so many ways that you could go about combining these two systems together. Technically, if you want, you could copy and paste. So if I unlocked this other patch, I could then select portions of my patch with my mouse. I can copy, go to my other patch, unlock, and then I can paste and start to connect them together. I could also try creating this from scratch. I think practically, like if you're starting Max for the first time, don't be shy of copying and pasting. That's totally fine as you're like getting used to working with Max. I recommend practicing the shortcuts, but copy and paste is going to be your friend. And so what I did just now, right, is I copied and pasted make note and note out from the previous patch, put it into the same system. And so I did that. I connected them rather quickly. So I'm going to just do that again. Here is the other system we just made just now with the random number. This is like the value, which is sending out a random, this is the random number coming from the random object. I can now attach this into the make note object. I want to go over the anatomy of this make note object a little bit more. So here you can see we have different notches which are connected into this object. These are called, the ones at the top are called inlets. The ones at the bottom are called outlets. And so inlets are where you connect things in, and outlets are where information goes out of. And so to make sure I'm changing the pitch correct, and not something else, I'm hovering my mouse over this object, and it's giving me a hint to verifying that I'm looking at the inlet for pitch. And so this might be hard to see on Zoom, but that's what I was doing when I was connecting this to just make sure everything is correct, right? And so you might want to do that when you're first starting as well. You might also want to check the assistance mode. So under options, that's going to help enable you to give you more hints about what you're looking at. And so now, right, everything is connected correctly. I want to change the pitch. If I lock my patch and hit this button, I now hear random pitches being triggering an instrument. Yeah.
Very cool. So, and anybody watching along, right? Max has a free trial that's good for like 30 days. So anybody watching can download Max and walk through this with you, and they can be programming in 10 minutes just
Yeah.
from these instructions.
Yes. Yes. Free trial is it. The subscription is $10 a month too, if you want to just try it for a little bit. Yeah. So we have a system to do some random notes, sending some random pitches to an instrument. So much more we could do with this.
Very cool. Well, and you know what? At this point, let me just ask you a few questions because we have about 10 minutes left, and we want to talk a little bit about some of the other projects you've worked on. So, we noticed that you're in a group called Cody, and so like that looks like a really interesting phenomenon, like this whole idea of performance programming. And so could you talk to us a little bit about what that feels like?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I am a live coder, right? So that's something that I like to do, which is live coding is the act of manipulating algorithms in real time for performance. And so people live code music, people live code visuals. In Cody, Cody is a live coding band. So actually, I'll bring up the website because it's a good website. We don't have any shows scheduled, but this is our website. So we're a live coding trio band, and so it's with me and two other people. So I'm with Sarah Groff-Henny Palermo and Kate Sicchio, and so the three of us together live code together. And so Kate and I live code music using Sonic Pi, and Sarah live codes her visuals using a framework she created called La Habra. And so the animation in the background is Sarah's animations, like a still or a GIF from one of her animations.
Fantastic. So, like, how does something like this happen? Like, how did you end up falling in with these other women, and how did you I mean, it's got to be a little nerve wracking, right? I mean, is it just the same kind of performance nerves that you have with any musical performance, or is there anything special about it?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky. I think being in New York was, great. There is a live coding community that I was introduced to. That's what started me. And so Sarah and Kate both invited me to these meetings. So there's like a meetup group called livecode.nyc. And so they're a meetup group in New York for people who are interested in live coding. And so they have a Discord now, they have meetings, they also post shows. So, like, they have these things called algoraves, which are performances where people make music and visuals with algorithms a lot. And so there's like just a lot of live coding. And so when you live code, it's also really common for people to share their code with the audience. So you can kind
Oh,
of see it in the screen, the code is in the background, and that's like part of the gig. You show your code so the audience follows along as you're doing the thing.
oh, that's really fun. And now Sonic Pi isn't a software that we've talked about yet in our course. Do you have a quick example of how that contrasts with Max?
Yeah. So Sonic Pi is a synth. For you can use it to live code. To contrast, uses Ruby syntax. So Max is visual programming. Ruby is text, right? So you write commands to create music. Um, I think it's so different, but I really enjoy it. What I like is it's really optimized for looping, like loop based.
Oh,
So what you do is you have these live loops that you manipulate, and so these loops are constantly being updated. And so as you change your loops, you change the music in real time. Um, yeah, it's I don't know, they're both so different, but lately I've been combining them both, which is
oh, that's interesting. So tell us more about that.
so I what I've been doing lately is I've been getting Sonic Pi and sending my audio through Ableton, and I also send some MIDI to Ableton. So Sonic Pi uses Super Collider, which is a different synth.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But you can also send your audio out from Super Collider to Ableton, and I sometimes do that for mixing. But what else I do is I like to do I do something where I sample myself as I perform. So I sample my voice, and then I manipulate those samples with code. And so I'm doing something similar in Ableton, where I create Max for live devices, because Max works with Ableton, right? And so I make Max devices that are inside Ableton, and so I send my audio from Sonic Pi into Ableton, into Max, to manipulate it with code, and then I use OSC from Sonic Pi to reprogram the Max device.
And OSC is another protocol like MIDI, right? I mean, OSC is another set of rules that computers use to ship information around. And I know we just have a few minutes. I mean, there's so much fascinating stuff you're doing here. We could talk for hours, but I don't want to hold you up. But I'm wondering for our students, like this is a complicated technical framework you've just described, right? With multiple pieces of software and multiple protocols happening. And so when you're working on this and you get stuck, as happens to my students and myself all the time, what's your go-to advice? Like, how do you dig yourself out? How do you not look at it? I think it's a problem for students when they get stuck and the voice in their head starts saying, see, you can't do this. See, this is too hard for you. This isn't the type of thing that you're good at. Like when you get stuck, what are the voices in your head saying?
Right. That's hard. That's like a hard one. For me, it's a lot of learning how to just quiet them down. I don't think those voices ever completely go away. Rather, there's like moments where maybe they're louder than other times, but then you just learn to turn off that doubt.
Oh,
Like, it's just like I know sometimes like people imagine just turning the knob down, so it's like lessens the strength. The other thing is just, I've also had to build up more confidence in my abilities to research or find the answer. I feel like that
Ah,
it's like such a big part of learning how to work with tech, or just, continuing to learn outside of school or continuing to grow. The skill of being able to know how to find the answers when you don't know the answer is a huge part. And that applies to music technology or programming. Because when you're in school, you only learn so much, but technology is always changing, and there's so many other languages that you're not going to get to. So you have to be like, learn how to figure things out.
that's a really important message. And I mean, understand like this is coming from someone who's a professor, who's Max certified. I mean, so there's no point where you're like, there, I'm done. I know everything. I'll never make another mistake. It's all downhill easy from here. That's just not the vibe of technology.
Right. Um, on a more practical note, for starting off with Max, I recommend going to YouTube. I honestly finding YouTube tutorials. The Music Hackspace group, which we mentioned a bit at the beginning, has free workshops sometimes on Max. I recommend checking them out. I have some of them. Some of them are taught by me. And then, talking about learning how to research or find answers, becoming familiar with the Max documentation is going to be useful. So I went to the help menu, I clicked on the reference, and then if I click on the home page, I can get to some place with this, and they have so many tutorials. So just studying, just study.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Max is, I've never really seen a language as well documented with as supporting and helpful a community. And so I think you're right. Like a lot of this comes down to building your confidence by knowing that you're part of a community. You're not in this alone. And I think to close out today, I think the fact that you're willing to take time away from all of the projects you're working on to come and show us how to get started in Max is evidence of that. And we're very grateful, Melody, for having you here today. And we really look forward to checking out your future appearances and kind of joining you in, some Discord chats. And I hope that we get a chance to work together in a lot of different ways in the future.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And our next computational music is going to be coming up in October. So have your set for that. Will be announced in the Connect page, and we'll be contacting everyone to let you know exactly the date and time. We have 3 more scheduled for this fall semester. So, Melody Loveless, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciated having you come in and speak to us today. And we really are grateful for your kindness and willingness to share with us. And congratulations on a great career. We're really looking forward to seeing what projects you take on next.
Thank you.
All right. So long, everybody. We'll see you next episode.